This is the third lecture in a Pharos study, which I'm calling A Shameful Conquest. And this lecture I'm entitling Two Nations or More. And it's about Britain's reactions to its own vote over Brexit. What worries me about Britain's present state as a country, and more widely about the state of the democratic world, though I'm not going to talk about that, is whether the divisions caused or perhaps revealed by Brexit are deep, durable or reparable. Were there fundamental divisions in the country that we hadn't realised until Brexit exposed them? Or did Brexit create new divisions, or a bit of both? And if so, how do we go beyond this? What was the situation before the 2016 referendum in which Britain voted to leave the EU? Most fundamentally, we and other democratic countries had the problem of what the Irish political scientist Peter Mair, in a seminal book, which I respectfully urge you to read if you haven't, it's actually quite short too, what he called ruling the void. He began writing this book in 2007, and he subtitled it The Hollowing of Western Democracy. In brief, he argues that the instruments of globalization, economic, institutional and cultural, have undermined democracy by removing, or indeed giving away, the powers of elected governments to international bodies, quangos, NGOs, central banks, law courts and so on. Mair gave the EU as a leading example of rule by bodies that, he said, were neither representative nor properly accountable. And this hollowing of democracy has caused voters increasingly to abandon politics and mainstream political parties as being powerless, thinking that they're all the same or they're dishonest and corrupt. And it's also caused the professional political class in all democracies to withdraw from democracy. Mair uses that word, to withdraw from democracy into these often supranational and certainly unelected institutions, which Mair calls a protected sphere in which policymaking can evade the constraints imposed by representative democracy. This protected sphere is, in Britain, colloquially termed the blob. In the case of the EU, the biggest blob of all, the political scientist Christopher Bickerton defines the distinction between nation states and member states of the EU. In nation states, governments derive their authority from their electorates, but in member states, they derive their authority from other governments. Hence the gap between what politicians often promise, which in the case of Greece and Italy have been very radical in recent years, and what they actually do, which is to conform to EU policies once in office. Partial exceptions have been Hungary and Poland, which have held out against EU pressure, with the story unfinished, and another partial exception is, of course, Britain. Here too, the long-term outcome of Brexit is still unclear. The void in Mair's title has opened between rulers and ruled. Brexit was clearly, I think, a rebellion against this void. Take back control was the slogan. But first of all, we have to recognise that this may have been a doomed rebellion. In the long run, it may not work, which we'll see. And second, it was a rebellion that was rejected and opposed by most of the ruling elites, who were very reluctant to change the status of member state for that of nation state. It's a perfect example of what Mair calls the withdrawal of elites. Also, and this needs some explanation, the return to being a nation state was also opposed by nearly half the country. This is what seems to me strange, which I'm going to try to explain. Before Brexit, it seemed that most people in Britain held pretty similar views on a range of topics. Future Remain voters were little different from future Leave voters, including UKIP voters, on political, social and cultural issues, including immigration, social equality, cultural issues, including immigration, ethnicity and national identity. so no visible gulf within the country. Immigration, for example, worried both sides. Before the referendum, 3/4 of the population thought it had been too high and too rapid. Few people were strongly in favour of the EU. Eurobarometer polling, which is what the EU itself does, showed that the UK was the country in which fewest people, only 6%, wanted more power to be given to Brussels. Only 5% felt, quote, more European than national, and few wanted the EU flag to fly on public buildings, which is almost universal elsewhere. But if the majority were not very keen on the EU, they were not very hostile either. I suppose they were resigned to EU membership as a fact of life. Most wanted a reformed EU, which they thought David Cameron might be able to negotiate. And that was pretty well my position too. Moreover, British attitudes to the EU were remarkably similar to those in other member countries. Basically, popular support for the EU across the bloc had peaked in the 1980s at nearly 80% in favour. It had fallen sharply in the 1990s and declined further from 2000 onwards as European economies were depressed by the euro and as trade between member countries stagnated. And then support fell sharply after the 2007 financial crisis, and by 2013, only 40% of people expressed trust or support in the EU, only half the 1980s figure. This showed itself first in negative or ambivalent votes on the Maastricht Treaty in France and Denmark in 1992, then on the euro. Denmark in 2000 and Sweden in 2003 voted no, and again in the 2005 European Constitution referendums when France and Holland voted no. More recently, there were no votes in Denmark in 2013 and in Holland 2016 on particular policies of the EU, and more importantly, referendums or general elections in Italy and Greece in 2015 had expressed mass opposition to the EU's economic policies. At the time of the British referendum, the percentage of people in Britain expressing a broadly unfavourable view of the EU was very similar to that in other countries. So unfavourable in the Netherlands was 46%, in Britain 48%, in Germany 48%, in Spain 49%. The French were far more negative, 61%, and especially Greece was the most negative, 71%. On specifically economic policy, many countries expressed greater disapproval of the EU than the UK. 55% in the UK disapproved, in Sweden it was 59%, Spain 65%, France 66%, Italy 68%, and Greece actually 92% of the population disapproved of the EU's economic policies. A majority in France wanted a referendum on membership, and as I said in my last lecture, President Macron thought there was a good chance that they would have voted to leave. More people in France thought the EU was bad for France, 38%, than thought it was good for France, 24%. So it seems to me that two things about the Brexit vote are surprising, given this background in Britain and across Europe, and require further explanation. First, that the result caused so much astonishment, and second, that the majority to leave was so small. My great mistake after the Brexit vote was to assume that the turbulence would soon die down, especially as official predictions of immediate economic and financial disaster did not materialise. I even wrote somewhere that in a few years it would be hard to find anyone who admitted having voted Remain. Why was I so wrong? This is a salutary lesson for historians, and especially for me. Historians don't like foretelling the future because they understand its unpredictability. But I don't even have that excuse. Nothing unexpected since the referendum has happened which can explain why I got it so wrong. It was already there somewhere beneath the surface. So the reasons why I was wrong in thinking that the debate would die down are, I suppose, the real subjects of this lecture. So I think we have to begin by looking at the details of the referendum vote on the 23rd of June 2016 on the question, quote, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? 51.9% chose to leave, compared with 48.1% who voted to remain. That's to say 17.4 million people to leave, 16.1 million to remain. In a parliamentary election, this vote would have given a huge majority of 150, as nearly 2/3 of all constituencies voted to leave. There was much overlap between the two sides. Regions, socioeconomic groups, sexes, ages, ethnicities, religions and occupations were all split, but there were, nevertheless, considerable differences in weighting. The sharpest divide was socioeconomic. The pattern was by now familiar across Europe. Wherever and whenever people had been allowed to vote on some EU matter, the lower middle class, the working class, and the less privileged, the excluded, the unemployed, and simply the rather less well-off, voted against the EU. The 2005 no vote in France had been principally caused by fear of job losses due to free movement among people like health workers and the self-employed. And indeed the pattern of the French vote was very similar to the British Brexit vote. Only Paris and its richer suburbs were strongly in favour of the constitution, which is also, as we shall see, what happened in Britain, where London was the only English region to choose Remain, 59.9% of voters. Wealthy Kensington and Chelsea was the highest, with 68.7% for Remain, while in plebeian Barking and Dagenham, only 37.6% wanted to remain. It was a similar story in the east of England, which voted 56.5% to leave. Cambridge, wealthy university city, voted to remain, 75.5%, while Peterborough, 30 miles away, voted 60.9% to leave, a difference of 35% in the vote of these almost neighbouring cities. These results are strikingly close to the general European picture, where 71% of the elites, but only 34% of the general public, believe that the EU benefited them. An important marker of class was higher education. 57% of those with university degrees voted Remain. The socio-economic difference was not solely a matter of income. A considerable minority of the middle class voted Leave, but also of milieu and identity. The Remain vote was highly concentrated, so that a typical Remain voter might hardly know anyone who voted Leave. I was at a party in Newnham, a very academic part of Cambridge, just after the referendum, and a lady said to me that she'd only just understood how people could vote Leave because her gardener and her cleaning lady had explained it to her. Many Remainers were high earners, but there was also a big left-behind element. University educated, economically struggling, often overqualified, feeling undervalued, politically marginalised, and strongly present in the public sector. And people like that were particularly likely to regard the EU as a protector of their interests and their principles, and they seem to have constituted the Remainer activist hardcore. In contrast, working class identity, concentrated in certain regions, often included a strong national element and strongly voted Leave. The economist Paul Collier points out that national solidarity is the bedrock of the rights of poorer citizens in Europe's nations. There was a decisive gender difference. Men overall were strongly for Leave, 55% to 45%. While more privileged groups, business, the professions, university students, tended towards Remain, it was women in those groups, particularly the youngest women, who were particularly pro-Remain. Also important was nationality. The Scots and the Northern Irish voted strongly for EU membership. In Scotland, 1.6 million, 62%, voted Remain, to 1 million, 38% voted Leave. This approval for the EU in Scotland was much higher than anywhere on the continent. In Northern Ireland, 440,000 voted Remain to 350,000 who voted Leave. The reasons were pretty clear. Scottish nationalists' hopes of independence relied on EU membership, and for many Irish people, common EU citizenship had smoothed over the old North-South divide. And to nationalists like Sinn Féin, it made unification of the island seem possible. England and Wales, almost to the same degree, were weighted towards leave, 53.3% and 52.5% respectively, closer to general European feelings about the EU. The youngest electors, the 18s to 24s, voted overwhelmingly to remain, especially students. Actually, 81% voted to remain, though young non-students, many of them working class, were rather closer to the general picture. A majority of all over 45s voted to leave. Nowhere in Western Europe in June 2016 was youth support for the EU as high as in the UK. In countries where young people had suffered high unemployment as a result of Eurozone policies, a bare majority was for the EU, or there was a majority against. When faced with concrete choices at the ballot box, young voters registered Euroscepticism. In the 2005 Dutch and French referendums, around 60% of young voters in both countries opposed the EU constitution, and in the 2015 Greek referendum, over 80% of the young voted against EU economic policies. When Emmanuel Macron stood as the only strongly pro-EU candidate in the French 2017 presidential elections, his support was lowest among young voters. In Britain, however, the same age group, especially its student element, untouched by the chronic unemployment wrecking the lives of their European contemporaries, seem to have focused on the idealised cosmopolitan vision of the EU and a perceived threat to travelling and studying in Europe. Relatively few of them actually do the latter. Only 9,540 British students out of 2.3 million used the EU's Erasmus scheme in 2017-18. And of all students studying abroad, far more went to the Anglosphere than to the continental EU. More broadly, there may be evidence that young people across the Western world, for whom not only the Second World War but also the Cold War are ancient history, may be less sensitive to issues of democracy and sovereignty, and hence more attracted by transnational individualism. Ethnic minorities favoured Remain. Some, of course, come from the EU, but non-European minorities also supported Remain. 67% of Asians, 70% of Muslims, 73% of black voters. Tower Hamlets, poor but with a high ethnic minority population, voted like rich Kensington and Chelsea. There may seem incongruity in people of non-European heritage voting for an organisation which is by definition Eurocentric in ideas and language, and whose policies towards the developing world and migrants are less than generous. But ethnic minority support for Remain may show how little the EU itself was really the issue for many voters. They seem instead to have been voting against a vision of an internal enemy, anti-immigrant, right-wing Tories and the middle-aged, male, white, provincial working class. This seems to me an important clue as to why the Brexit division did not disappear. In other words, it wasn't really about the EU, or not solely, and why it even widened out into other issues later. There was a sharper left-right division in attitudes to the EU in the UK than in other parts of Europe, and that may account for some of the above differences. In Britain, the left, Labour, and the centre-left, Liberal Democrats and Greens, strong among the educated young and ethnic minorities, voted largely to Remain. Some on the British left relied on EU legislation to carry out their aims, rather than persuading the British electorate to do so, showing a pessimism about British politics, it's been suggested. Whereas the continental left is less pro-EU, being more conscious of its policies as a source of unemployment and falling living standards. Indeed, in Sweden, France and Greece, the left is more critical of the EU than the right, as Labour used to be in the UK. So in short, the 2016 British vote was not particularly British. That is, it reflected views of the EU common across the Union. Indeed, the Leave vote was more typically European than the Remain vote. Yet almost every week, sometimes several times a week, I get articles arriving in my inbox analysing the supposed peculiarity and the pathological nature of the Brexit vote in England. The same assumption appears in a whole shelf full of popular and academic books, and I'll try to analyse this in my last lecture. But in this lecture, I want to look mainly at the Remain vote a little more and its context, and then to look at some of the political, constitutional and legal conflicts that followed the referendum. I'm not going to give a narrative, but to focus on certain themes and events that seem to me significant. Why did people vote the way they did? An exit poll taken as people left the voting stations is pretty clear. Among Leave voters, the largest group, 49%, 8.5 million people, said their main motive had been that the principal decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK, and other reasons given for Leave voting were similarly political. Behind this is both an emotional attachment to national sovereignty and a range of other issues, most obviously immigration, which one might sum up as the hope that a British government outside the EU would pay more attention to voters' wishes. Remain voters said they were mainly motivated by economic considerations, principally that, I quote, "the risks of voting to leave the EU looked too great when it came to things like the economy, jobs and prices." Nearly a fifth feared isolation, but only 9% of Remain voters claimed to be primarily motivated by, quote, "a strong attachment to the EU and its shared history, culture and traditions." I've suggested elsewhere that Remain voters could be divided into three groups. This broad grouping may be a little lacking in subtlety, but nothing has made me think it's basically wrong. There may be more overlap between them than a clear divide would suggest, but I think it's a question of priority motives. We all obviously have mixed motives. The first group, which I've already mentioned as being a small group, I would call ideological Remainers. The 9% of Remain voters, about 1.5 million people, who claim to be primarily motivated by an emotional attachment to the European project. They support greater power being exercised by EU institutions, and some think of themselves as being primarily Europeans. For those sharing this sentiment, who seem to include elderly as well as youthful idealists, the EU shares the same lineage as the League of Nations, the United Nations, and even the Green Movement. Whatever its shortcomings, they feel it somehow expresses peace on earth and goodwill to men. It embodies European civilization in a traditional form, ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, but shorn of its darker qualities. And according to the philosopher John Gray, they think of themselves as embodiments of reason, facing down the ignorant passions of the unwashed rabble. They may regard British and English national identity as outdated or even dangerous, and they sometimes hold vehemently negative views of Britain and England and its history. Add to the mixture a strong dash of anti-Americanism and post-colonial guilt. Such sentiments have quite a long pedigree, harking back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1940, George Orwell mocked those, he said, who would feel more ashamed of standing to attention during God Save the King than of stealing from a poor box. This small Europeanist current was barely articulated in the referendum campaign, which had little to say about the EU or its future, a fundamental weakness in their campaign both before and after the referendum vote. Yet it doubtless provided much of the vocal enthusiasm and activism of the post-referendum Remain movement. I expect one could include in this group the man who spent a lot of time outside the Houses of Parliament shouting through a megaphone. The second category, I suggest, are what I would call professional Remainers, whose common characteristics are commitment to membership of the EU through their careers and personal interests. For this they cannot be condemned as long as their motives are open, like the Cambridge scientist who said publicly that, I quote, "Half of my postdocs come from Europe, my research funding comes from the EU, for me it's a no-brainer." This group includes executives of multinational companies, parts of the public sector, employees of lobby groups and NGOs, universities and think tanks, especially the many that receive EU funding, employees of media organisations that supported Remain, businesses relying on EU immigrants or exporting a lot to the EU market, civil servants or diplomats accustomed to a high level of cooperation with EU institutions, and politicians representing Remain parties or constituencies or whose careers have been marked by strong support for the EU. The Leave vote, said the ardent Remainer Lord Adonis, had caused, quote, "a nervous breakdown in Whitehall." It was reported that the view in Whitehall is that of the 40 or so permanent secretaries, that's to say heads of civil service departments, only one voted for Leave. I mentioned last time Lord MacDonald, former head of the Foreign Office, who disclosed that Foreign Office staff had been in tears after the referendum, and he told them that he had voted Remain as a sort of consolation. So we see how powerful this professional Remainer mindset could be. Just to remind you, this is what Peter Mayer terms the withdrawal of the elites into the EU. For its adepts, familiarity with complicated EU systems and contacts in Brussels gave invaluable career advantages. Conversely, Brexit posed a risk, indeed a humiliation. As one former diplomat put it, our governing class, one might call them the progressive liberal consensus that encompasses a large chunk of MPs from the mainstream parties, senior civil servants, sections of the media, big business and their associated lobbyists, have suddenly found that their authority is under attack and their natural right to dictate the agenda is called into question, and they don't like it. Of course, professional Remainers might also be ideological Remainers, but they're not necessarily so. Dominic Cummings later wrote, quote, "The government machine, the Commission and the Cabinet Office were effective in scaring off prominent people from supporting us. Many of them told us, some embarrassed, about the phone calls they'd had and their duty to shareholders and so on. Professional Remainers were by far the most influential and powerful element in the Remain camp, both before and after the referendum. Their arguments tended to be technical, such as the cost and complexity of leaving, rather than political or historical. It's difficult to estimate the size of this group, though its size is of less consequence than its influence. Nevertheless, we may have a rough indication. The percentage of the British population who said before the referendum campaign that they thought the EU was an economic success was only 15%, and those who thought the EU was broadly going in the right direction was only 20%. This total probably includes the ideological Remainers. We might therefore estimate professional Remainers, very roughly, at around 10 to 15% of the electorate. This group probably shares a managerial rather than a populist conception of politics and are quite likely to be risk-averse. My third category, by far the largest, are what I call worried Remainers, the 43% of Remain voters who are motivated by economic worries. This is the largest and most malleable group which almost tipped the referendum. Roughly 7 million people, over 20% of all who voted. Before the referendum was called, only 15% of the population, as I noted earlier, thought that the EU economy was doing well. In this difference between those who thought the EU was a success and the larger number who feared leaving it, that's a difference of 6% of the whole electorate, we can surely see the effects of Project Fear, which I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in inflating the Remain vote, not because of a belief in EU success, but because of fear that leaving it would be worse. These included the people that a Downing Street opinion pollster called the Hearts versus Heads group. My heart says we should leave the EU, but my head says that it's too risky. Project Fear, which I mentioned before. The name and the strategy, as you may recall, goes back to the Scottish referendum of 2014, when it was used very successfully. And George Osborne, the Chancellor, was very active, though not the only contributor to Project Fear through Treasury documents. But David Cameron, too, the Prime Minister, gave a succession of public warnings about unemployment, risks to pensions, damage to farming, risk to national defence and the NHS. The government drummed up battalions of business leaders and marshalled a parade of foreign politicians to, well, let's say, influence the voters, including President Obama, with his warning that in future trade relations with the USA, post-Brexit Britain would go to the back of the queue. But particularly important were, as I said earlier, George Osborne, the Chancellor, and the Treasury. The Treasury produced very alarmist forecasts of the effects of leaving the EU, including predicting that exports to the EU would fall by half. That hasn't happened. But the major element in the damage it forecast was a predicted decline in productivity caused by an assumed reduction in foreign trade. But, and this is worth noting, though it's slightly technical, the model they used was mostly derived from developing countries in the 1960s and 70s, such as African countries which started trading in the international market. Well, in developing countries like that, increasing foreign trade does indeed cause increased productivity. But in developed countries, of which Britain was one, there is no effect whatever of increasing foreign trade on productivity. Yet this argument accounted for roughly half the total losses that the Treasury predicted, including the supposed 4% loss of GDP, which has been endlessly repeated ever since. By such calculations, the Treasury calculated or predicted that Britain would lose 36 billion a year in revenue. But the Treasury itself had calculated 10 years earlier that the effect of EU membership on UK exports was only a small fraction of what they claimed in 2016. And they refused to discuss their methods or their findings with academic economists, which is unusual. So I think we can conclude, and indeed this was more or less admitted by the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, that these predictions were produced in order to affect the referendum result. It carried on afterwards. Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, assured the House of Commons that there would be almost 1 million fewer jobs in the UK by 2020. The vocal Remainer MP Heidi Allen told a meeting in her South Cambridgeshire constituency that 8 million jobs would be lost, a quarter of all the jobs in the country, and 16 times the already extreme Treasury estimate. In fact, as I said in an earlier lecture, unemployment actually fell. It's often said by disgruntled Remainers that the referendum campaign was based on lies. There were lies, or at least misleading statements on both sides, but the least that can be said is that the biggest were on the Remain side. And that's my explanation of why the majority to leave was not larger. After the referendum was declared, you will recall that Cameron resigned as Prime Minister, and the two main Tory leaders of the Leave campaign, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, sabotaged each other, leaving Theresa May to take over as Prime Minister. Whether Johnson and Gove were capable of leading a strong pro-Brexit government is impossible to say. We might feel doubtful given their later performance. But what is sure is that May's period in office was disastrous. For one reason, as Michel Barnier, the EU's negotiator, put it, she was infinitely preferable to a Brexiteer, as she doesn't like Brexit and never wanted it. Negotiations carried on under her authority were perhaps inevitably extraordinarily weak and unsuccessful. Moreover, the pro-Remain Chancellor, Philip Hammond, had moved from the Foreign Office to the Treasury, was accused by colleagues of blocking preparations for a possible no deal. I was told that personally by one of his senior cabinet colleagues. In this period, the British conceded to the EU the right to set the timetable, agreed to paying vast sums of money into the EU budget, and agreed that there should be no border in Ireland. And they got nothing in return. This gave the EU huge and permanent negotiating advantages. The second disaster under May was to call and then almost lose a snap general election in 2017. One of the leading organisers of the Leave campaign has told me that he considers this the turning point, as well as weakening the government in Parliament. It reopened the whole Brexit debate, encouraging Remainers to do all they could to block Brexit and campaign for a second referendum. One scholar has estimated that 10 to 20% of the electorate, which is to say 20 to 40% of the Remain voters, refused to accept the result of the first referendum. If my guesstimates are roughly accurate, that would include all the ideological and professional Remainers. Many prominent Remainers, including Tony Blair, Keir Starmer and Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, and MPs of several parties, including Conservatives, had meetings with Michel Barnier in which they encouraged him to believe that a second referendum was possible and even urged him to help to cause a political crisis in Britain, which Barnier, to his credit, would have nothing to do with. But I think this indicates the strength of some of the motives on the Remain side. As I said, I'm not going to give a narrative of this rather depressing period. It's been well done in two books by Tim Shipman, the journalist Tim Shipman. May was forced out of office by heavy defeats in the Commons and finally by a collapse in Tory electoral support and the steep rise of the Brexit Party, confirmed in the European elections of May 2019. But other means were available to the anti-Brexit diehards, and I want to look briefly at two of them. First, legal action, and second, action in Parliament. These two came to be linked. First, two legal actions led by a previously unknown businesswoman named Gina Miller, who stated that Brexit was, I quote, one of the most extreme right-wing experiments we have witnessed since the 1930s. I want to look briefly at the legal arguments and at how novel they were. First was an action in 2017 to require the May government to seek parliamentary approval, legislation, before notifying the EU of Britain's intention of leaving under the terms of the Treaty of Lisbon. It had previously never been suggested that a vote in Parliament was necessary, as concluding and ending treaties is a matter for the executive, in Britain, the royal prerogative. Whether you think this is good or bad, that's how things were understood before, and I mention it because it shows how the law could be reinterpreted, though in fact it made no difference because Parliament did vote to sanction leave by a huge majority. A plausible explanation is that the Supreme Court, in giving this decision, was following the legal thinking of the European Court of Justice, whereas the dissenting minority of the court was following British legal thinking and precedent. The second Miller case was brought to stop Boris Johnson's government from proroguing, that is to say, suspending Parliament for 5 weeks in 2019. The first judgment by the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls and the President of the Queen's Bench, 3 very senior judges, decided that the government had acted within its long-established powers in a matter of political judgment. Hence, the decision of the Prime Minister to advise Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament is not justiciable in Her Majesty's courts. But the Supreme Court, in an incoherent, that's my view, yet unanimous judgment, on the 24th of September 2019, ignored this earlier court decision and overturned more than 3 centuries of constitutional practice, bypassing Article 9 of the Bill of Rights of 1689, which prohibited, quote, any court from questioning proceedings in Parliament, and judging the prorogation unlawful, null, and of no effect. One eminent Oxford legal scholar described this surely political judgment as, quote, wholly unjustified by law and a misuse of judicial power. It was, he wrote, neither legal nor constitutional, but purely political, and it would unhesitatingly have been rejected by all previous generations of judges back to the Bill of Rights. That's his opinion. Seems to me quite convincing, or at least striking, and it shows how the law was becoming involved in this political debate over Brexit. The second Remainer tactic I want to look at briefly concerns Parliament, and particularly the House of Commons. Long-established constitutional practice is that the government controls the parliamentary agenda. We don't have a formal separation of powers in Britain, but we do have a distinction of functions between government and legislature. Indeed, in no modern state does the legislature have the authority to conduct policy. In all democratic systems, the executive necessarily has its own powers and responsibilities, for which it answers not only to Parliament, but also to the electorate. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister on the 24th of July 2019 with a large majority, but Remainers used parliamentary manoeuvres, Remainers including members of his own party, the Conservative Party, to try to control government policy in an incipient constitutional crisis, though in retrospect its absurdities perhaps balance its dramas. The aim was to force the government, quote, to take no deal off the table. That was the catchphrase of the time, which meant that the government could not finally leave the EU without reaching an agreement with the EU. It could not simply say, we're going to leave and we'll rely on existing international law and trade agreements. And this meant that until the EU accepted an agreement, Johnson would be required by legislation to request indefinite extensions to British membership. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte compared this to the Titanic voting to move the iceberg. More practically, as Johnson colourfully put it, it would chop the legs out from under the UK. The government would be unable to refuse the EU's terms, or the stalemate would be prolonged indefinitely. Remainers hoped that the public, disillusioned and impatient, would then acquiesce in a second referendum, which they called a people's vote, which would reverse the first people's vote. In September 2019, the House of Commons, with the connivance of the Speaker John Bercow, who was himself avowedly a Remainer, seized control of business, and with the support of some 20 Remainer Conservative MPs, including former ministers, passed what was called the Benn Act, which actually dictated the terms of a letter that Johnson was thereby required by law to send to the EU requesting an extension to British membership. Hotheads menaced him with impeachment and being sent to prison if he disobeyed. The act was blatantly unconstitutional, but the government did not force a crisis which might have involved the monarch refusing consent to Major's legislation for the first time for 3 centuries. Johnson had already advised the Queen on the 28th of August to prorogue Parliament with the clear, if unstated, intention of limiting further infringement on executive authority. This aspect seems to have been ignored by the Supreme Court. Admittedly, the government had not argued it, and the Supreme Court, as I said a moment ago, declared the prorogation null and void. Now, I've dwelt on these somewhat technical points because I think they show the determination of a large part of the political and administrative elite to stop Brexit, and that they were not always too scrupulous about how they did it, including giving advice to foreign diplomats, overriding constitutional conventions in Parliament, and reinterpreting established constitutional law. You may regard their motives as of the highest. You may think they were acting in the best interests of the country. But the general election in 2019, as well as the referendum, and Johnson's victory, largely based on a promise to get Brexit done, trumped these efforts, at least in part. And at least in the immediate future, the Remainers' attempts to foil Brexit were defeated by the electorate. But May's concessions could not be reversed and have not, in fact, been reversed, especially those over Ireland and the Irish border. So Brexit more or less was done, at least in the short term, as we don't know whether a future Labour government under Keir Starmer would formally or informally nullify Brexit. Barnier says in his memoirs that when he first met Starmer, he tipped him as a future Prime Minister and thought he would take Britain back into a Norway-style dependency on the EU. In the light of all this, if I were asked, is Britain a sovereign state, I would answer probably yes, at least for the time being. But if sovereignty cannot be exercised, then it is in reality lost. But more was going on than pure politics, though plenty of politics, of course, there was. There were things going on in culture and in society, and I want to look at those things in the next and final lecture, and look at the way in which the Brexit debate connected with and connects with the other issues in what are now commonly called the culture wars. Thank you again for your attention.